In this video, we're going to examine how fiscal and monetary policies affect the equilibrium level of income in the short run. We're going to use the ISLM model that we've developed so far in order to see how changes in fiscal policy or monetary policy influence economic performance of the economy. I emphasize the short run because if a policy changes in the long run, that affects the future of the economy and therefore expectations of people about the future. So we need to focus on the short run first and see what happens when policies change temporarily within a year or so. And then we're going to examine what happens when policies change in the longer run for many years and therefore do influence expectations of people, which in turn are going to have short-run effects. Let's first focus on monetary policy. Suppose that money supply is M0 at some point and the economy has come to some equilibrium, like this point, interest rate I0, income level Y0, and the central bank decides to increase the money supply to M1, higher than M0. We know that such an increase in money supply will lower the LM curve or make it rotate to the right, downward, clockwise, whichever way you want to describe it. The reason the LM curve becomes flatter is that an increase in money supply means that there's more money available for people to hold than they really want at the current interest rate, and they go and buy bonds. And they push up the price of bonds that lowers interest rate. Until at the lower interest rate, people are happy holding the amount of money that the central bank offers them. So that's the new position of the LM curve, flatter, as a result of an increase in money supply. Now, it's also important to ask what happens to the IS curve when the money supply goes up. The answer to that is that there's no change there's no shift in the IS curve because money supply does not directly enter the relationship between interest rate and income level. Money supply does affect the interest rate, but that change in interest rate would be a movement along the IS curve, not a shift in the IS curve. As a result, the new equilibrium is going to be established at the crossing point of the new LM curve, LM1, and the old IS curve at the point where we have interest rate equal to I1 and income is at Y1. As you can see, as interest rate goes down, income level goes up. And remember, the mechanism is that a reduction in interest rate stimulates investment. It also lowers the exchange rate and stimulates net exports. All of this, of course, are short-run effects in response to temporary increase in money supply. If these policies are long-term, changes are long-term, then the effects would be more complicated, to which we are going to turn later on. The next step is to look at the impact of a change in fiscal policy. For example, let's suppose government expenditure is equal to G0 and the government decides to increase its expenditure temporarily in the short run. Let's start with the D curve and see what happens to the D curve, then come back and see what happens to the IS curve, and then what happens to the equilibrium level of income and interest rate based on the ISLM model. Starting from the initial situation where income level is Y0 and aggregate preferred expenditure is D0, equilibrium level of income is the crossing point of the D curve and the 45-degree line. Let's see what happens if government expenditure goes up. An increase in government expenditure increases aggregate expenditure at every income level, and that leads to a shift in the D curve upward. So the D curve shifts up, and now the D curve crosses the 45-degree line at a higher point because of the direct impact of government expenditure and also indirect impact of an increase in household income, which in turn increases household expenditure. So the end result is an increase in income as a result of an increase in government expenditure, usually with a multiplier. Now let's see how the increase in government expenditure affects the IS curve. Let's start from the initial position of the IS curve. Income level is Y0, interest rate is I0, and we want to know what happens to the IS curve once government expenditure goes from G0 to G1. As government expenditure increases, at given interest rate I0, we've seen income increases, let's say to Y1, and this is true for every interest rate. As a result, the position of the IS curve cannot stay where it was, and it's going to shift to the right. Remember that the LM relationship is money supply equal to K PY over I. Government expenditure does not show up directly in this relationship, so there's no shift in the LM curve. Government expenditure does impact income level, but a change in income level is a movement along the LM curve. So the equilibrium is going to be moving from point E to point F along the LM curve, where the LM curve crosses the IS curve, the new IS curve. The result is going to be an increase in interest rate from I0 to I1, and income level is going to go from Y0 to Y1. Notice that if interest rate had not gone up, income level would have gone to Y2, a higher level. So equilibrium of the economy would take place at point G. The reason interest rates go up is that an increase in government expenditure raises the level of income. People need more money for their transactions, and they need to get rid of their bonds in order to hold money. But as they try to sell their bonds, the price of bonds fall and interest rates rise. Now, in order to fully understand what happens after government expenditure goes up, let's look at this quick question. Let's compare the situation at point F compared to point E, and compare the level of investment and net exports in these 2 points. Are investment and net exports going to be higher at point F compared to point E? Are they going to be lower? Maybe investment is going to be higher, net exports is going to be lower, or vice versa, or maybe they remain unchanged. Take a look at these questions and pick your choice. The correct answer is that both investment and net exports are going to be lower. And let's see why. As interest rate rises, that discourages investment, but it also raises the exchange rate. It causes the exchange rate to appreciate, and that discourages net exports. As a result, as government expenditure increases, part of that increase is going to be canceled out by the reductions in investment and net exports. Let me highlight this issue a little bit further, because it's very important to see to what extent an increase in government expenditure causes net exports and investment to go down, and therefore the impact of government expenditure on GDP is going to be muted as a result of that. I mentioned that if the interest rate had remained at level I0, then income level would have gone to Y2, much higher than Y1. The difference between Y2 and Y1 is exactly because of the negative impact of government expenditure on investment and net exports through the rise in interest rates. This difference between Y2 and Y1 is very important, and it has a name. It's called crowding out effect. Increased fiscal expenditure causes net exports and investment to go down, or crowds out those expenditures. And as a result, the impact of government expenditure on GDP is going to be muted to that extent. Now, you may wonder, how significant is the crowding out effect? Well, to do this, let's examine the multiplier effect, how much GDP goes up for every dollar of increase in government expenditure, taking into account the crowding out effect. The figures I'm going to present is based on a recent study produced by the International Monetary Fund, IMF. This study shows that the multiplier is generally between 0 and 2 across world countries. On average, the multiplier is less than 1, meaning that if government expenditure goes up by $1, GDP goes up by less than $1. The full multiplier effect without the crowding out effect must have been bigger than 1, as we've seen before, because $1 of expenditure by the government should become $1 of income, and then that additional income should generate its own expenditure. The fact that the average multiplier effect is less than 1 shows that the crowding out effect is quite significant, quite large, and therefore reduces the impact of government expenditure significantly. The multiplier effect depends on a variety of factors, varies across countries quite a bit. For example, in industrial countries, the multiplier effect tends to be much larger than in developing countries. The reason for this is that in developing countries, usually the capacity is full, and increased government expenditure does not leave much room for expansion, and as a result, the crowding out effect is much bigger. We're going to examine the role of production capacity limitations in developing countries in a later video. The other factor that affects the multiplier effect is the exchange rate regime. If a country has a fixed exchange rate regime, the multiplier effect tends to be larger. The reason is very simple. As government spends more, interest rate does not respond much under fixed exchange rate regimes, and also the exchange rate itself does not appreciate to have an impact through the net exports. Under flexible exchange rate regimes, then the multiplier effect becomes smaller because the crowding out effect becomes much stronger. Another factor to take into account is the openness of the economy. If the economy is open, means that it's importing a big chunk of its consumption, and as a result, a bigger chunk of the increase in government expenditure is going to fall on imports rather than on domestic production. So the impact on domestic production and the multiplier effect is going to be weaker. And finally, high debt countries don't seem to benefit much from increased government expenditure, possibly because as they spend more, it becomes very clear that they're more likely to run into debt problems in the future or not be able to pay back, and therefore people take that into account, and production does not respond the same way that in countries that do not have much debt, and therefore government expenditure can expand and lead to increased debt without much problem in the future.